Hello and welcome to the January UN Info Session. I'm Alex, an intern with the San Diego chapter of the United Nations Association. The San Diego chapter was founded in 1946 to promote local engagement with the United Nations, and it's one of the oldest and most active chapters within the United States. I'm very excited to be with Mike Connolly Miskwish of the Campo Tribe of Kumeyaay Indians. He's the author of several Kumeyaay history and cosmology texts. He helped establish and direct one of the first tribal environmental protection agencies within the United States, and he is the chief executive of a private consulting firm, the Laguna Resource Services Incorporated, which specializes in Native American projects. We'll be discussing the importance of the Kumeyaay people, as well as what sustainability and earth stewardship means to the Campo Tribe. This is of particular relevance to us here in San Diego County because not many people know that San Diego has more tribes than any other county in the United States. Further, the geological and ecological diversity of the region makes it a biodiversity hotspot with lots of traditionally significant plants, animals, and lands. And unfortunately, the geography also puts San Diego at risk for several different impacts of climate change, including drought, wildfires, sea level rise, flooding, etc. And so it's important to remember that the preservation of these lands lies in the knowledge of the people who know them best. So welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Alex.
Would you mind starting off by sharing a bit about your background and work?
Okay, well, my background, I'm a member of the Campo Band of the Kumeyaay Nation. I was an elected leader for 17 years. I was on the council. My education is engineering and economics. I have a master's in economics from San Diego State, and I worked for a large part of my life in the aerospace industry. I was an aerospace engineer, worked for some of the major companies, Boeing, Rockwell International, Northrop, Rohr Industries. And in 1990, the tribe needed somebody to head up the environmental office at the reservation. And so I left the aerospace industry and started working in the environmental field. And I also started doing a lot of historical research at the same time. And I started finding a lot of applications, traditional environmental knowledge that we could apply in addressing modern issues in the environment on the reservation. And so I started incorporating that, and there was a kind of a synergy that developed. I continued to work on that, and around the mid-90s I started consulting and started looking, also from the historical context. I saw a lot of constraints that were against the economies of the reservations and some of the things that were holding them back. And so I started doing more and more in that area until I eventually got my master's in economics. And so that's where I'm at today. I work in, I gave myself the title of a resource economist, and I figure that's a broad enough name to cover a lot of different things, from environment to history to taxation. So it's kind of, I pick projects. I'm at this stage in my life where I can pick the projects that I want to work on and do that. So I work with Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association, and I'm the liaison to the San Diego Association of Governments, and work with them on a whole range of different transboundary issues between different jurisdictions, and do a lot of work for Campo, technical work, assisting them in different projects that they're doing on the reservation. And I work for a lot of intertribal organizations, especially the Kumeyaay organizations, in different historical projects that they ask me to work on.
Awesome. So given that you're an expert in tribal historical knowledge, I'm curious if you could elaborate on who the Kumeyaay people are and how long they've been in this region, just more about them in general.
Well, our our standard answer is we've been here for time immemorial. It's cultures change over time, and we don't know what language or dialects were 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago. We know that the culture changed over time, and what we see in more and more, there's confirmation that at least for the last 15,000 years, there's been pretty much continuous habitation here. So even if the culture did change, and even if the language changed, and then different burial practices came about, different types of technology were introduced, we believe that we're still descendants from those original people. If there were new populations that moved in, there was intermarriage. There's no evidence that one group ever came in and wiped out 100% of the previous group. So we feel there's that unbroken chain, and that's also confirmed with some of the genetic analysis that has been done, and we know that there are certain traits that designate or that identify us as being from this region, and those are things that are unique to people from this region. So in essence, we became who we are, where we are, through this interaction over a long period of time being in one location. The Kumeyaay people have originally, our governments were organized along clans, and we called them shamuls, and they ranged from the San Luis Rey River. At the time of the Spanish, they ranged from the San Luis Rey River down south of Baja and out to the sand dunes out in the desert, and even some populations to the Colorado River. And there was a lot of variation within the clans, and even different dialects that clans would speak. So it's there's a lot of diversity, and a lot of diversity culturally, and a lot of diversity in our environment. We have probably one of the most diverse of any native group in North America, because we went from the ocean, the maritime, to the chaparral, to the alpine forests, the high desert, and then the low desert. So. And we had groups who would actually transition during the seasons, would go from the coast to the mountains, or from the desert to the mountains, and then back down. So there's just a huge amount of knowledge that was gained from these interactions with the environment over time.
Excellent. And I think that's an interesting point, that there was a lot of kind of migration between the different regions of the Kumeyaay people. And I'm curious, since the tribe originally and still contains land south of the border, how did the development and emergence of the border wall kind of impact how the Kumeyaay people were able to be connected?
Well, we still have very strong links with the Kumeyaay in Mexico. We have 12 reservations in the United States that are Kumeyaay, and we have 4 ejidos in Mexico, and parts of a couple other ejidos in Mexico that are Kumeyaay. And when I was young, the border was 4 strands of barbed wire, and it was it wasn't much. People came and went. There were informal crossing places all along the border. We had one in Campo where people would cross, and it wasn't an official place. And sometimes cows would knock the fence down, and farmers would actually go and cut the border fence, go over there, round up their cattle, and then retie the fence when they came back. And it was not a big deal. I remember some visitors from Baja one time who had come up to visit my family at Campo, and when they were ready to head back to Mexico, they we offered them a ride, and they said, "Oh no, that's okay. We'll get a ride from the Border Patrol." And I said, "Well, how do you do that?" And they said, "Well, we just wave the Border Patrol, and they pick us up and take us back to Tecate and let us go. So that's how they take us back to Mexico." And so that was kind of what it was. And when they started really enforcing the border, and put up the initial walls and started getting more restrictive, we had a lot of concerns, and so we met with the Border Patrol, we met with Customs, and they we made an agreement with them that we provided them with a list of the tribal members from the Ejidos in Mexico, and if they came through Tecate, that they would be able to get passes for a short visit. So that way they could come up for ceremonies and funerals and celebrations and things like that. So it was difficult in the beginning because we started this in the 90s, and you had to have a passport. They had to have a Mexican passport in order to use this service that we had set up. And Mexico at the time would not issue a passport to any man who had not served military service. So we had a lot of men who weren't able to come across because they weren't able to get a passport. But that changed then in the latter part of the 90s, and they opened it up so that anyone could get a passport, and then we were able to get more of the people coming up. So we're working a lot with them, and I think it's taken a lot. We've had to kind of enforce some changes. The villages, the Ejidos in Mexico, had to get a more structured government where they had an actual role of their members and who was officially a member and who wasn't, which was something that wasn't really, they never really had to deal with that before, and because people had married into some of the Ejidos, and so they had to come up with what their criteria was going to be, and so in that way it's kind of sad that they lost some of the traditional governance that they had before, but it's good that we were able to still meet the issues that were being put to us by the restrictions on the border. And it's I think where we've had more of a complaint on the border than anything is that when they did the border wall, they did it as that it was a matter of national security, and they waived a lot of the environmental laws and the archaeological laws. Yeah. So they went through, some of them were burial sites and some really rich archaeological sites that were just
decimated.
Destroyed, decimated as they came through. So that was very sad. I think it was unnecessary for them to do it that way, but we did manage to get into some of the places. Some of our tribal archaeologists were able to get in and
restore
and rescue some of the stuff and preserve it. So.
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot of unintended consequences, I think, with the wall establishment. The damage of biodiversity and cultural artifacts being several of some of the most overlooked, I think, especially with all of the laws that were waived at the time.
It's interesting that if you go in and make war against a cultural site, it's considered a war crime. And,
very pointed comments, I think.
But in the name of national security, you can go destroy it, and it's okay.
So I recently read part of the California Climate Change Assessment Report in which you were a contributing author, and it talks a lot about the term tribal ecological knowledge, and you mentioned it earlier in terms of basically indigenous practices or tribal knowledge that can be applied to modern sustainability. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Well, you could probably take a whole semester course in it. Actually, we have an Kumeyaay ethnobotany course at Kumeyaay Community College that covers a lot of that, and a traditional ecology course too. So, and they're both pretty good, pretty comprehensive courses. So it's I guess you really have to go in and look at the whole perception of the relationship that people have with the environment. And for us, there's no word in our language for nature. the word nature means everything except humans. And we never had that word because that was, how could you even make that definition? How could you define people out of the world around you? We are part, did we drop?
No, we're good. Continue. I'm just working with the video now.
But, we are part of the world around us, and the idea that the world is there, for us to do things to, rather than to be a part of and be with, is different. Our word for the earth, for dirt, is mut, and our word for our body is mut. And so it just depends on the context as to how you use it. Our affirmation is ha, and it means yes, but it also means water. So our word for God is my ha, the high water. Within the language are all of these different elements that speak to this relationship that we have with the resources around us. So when we harvest resources, whether it's acorns from acorn groves, or whether it's grasses or other types of plants, sage, medicinal plants, there isn't just that relationship of the plant that's there for us to take. It's something that where when we take it as part of a relationship, and we also have an obligation to those resources to take care of them and to help promote them. So we plant, we prune, the way that you harvest the plant can help to enhance it and also fires. We used fire. There was within Southern California what has been termed a fire mosaic. So all of these little patches of burned out areas. We didn't have the mega fires that we have nowadays. We had little patchwork areas that burned, and then there were areas that were in these different stages of transition. Mm-hmm. So, of course, this was a couple hundred years ago, but so it's hard to get any scientific data to support, what has been passed down in oral history and in traditional knowledge. But there were some studies that were done in Australia, Western Australia, where they also had the fire mosaic, and they had traditional burning, and they had that up until the 1960s when the Indian people were taken and put into missions, and the fire mosaic disappeared, and it became the large monoculture of the climax vegetation. And there were studies that were done, and they were actually able to show how the biodiversity and the carrying capacity of the land dropped as you lose that fire mosaic. So
fire mosaic kind of implies a more diverse planting as well.
You have all of the plants that come up that are fire dependent that come up in the mosaic, and then eventually they give way to the climax vegetation. And I don't even like using the term climax because that implies that that's the ultimate end, but it's really just one stage in a cycle. So you're in this cyclic type of activity that goes from the beginning, and there is no beginning, but it goes through these different stages, and fire opens it up, and you have certain plants that will come in during those openings, and then they'll transition to other plants, and transition to other plants, until you eventually get the vegetation that's ready for the next burn. Mm-hmm. It also creates open spaces. There's a lot more food for a lot of the game animals that come out into the mosaic to eat, and then that in turn provides more food for the raptors and other predators that feed on them. So humans benefited from it, and the whole ecosystem benefited, and there were more resources that were available then to everybody in the ecosystem by having this fire mosaic. Now we have these monocultures of climax vegetation that ends up having catastrophic burns. Yes. That actually, in some ways, they favor invasives that are more adapted to going into some of these catastrophic burn areas rather than the native plants that would normally dominate in a low grade micro burn in a mosaic pattern.
Got it.
So that was something that we did as part of our interactions with the environment. There's other things like the chia plant. When you harvest chia, they had these baskets, and they beat the chia, beat the chia, and the seeds would fall into the basket. So the seeds that were from the tallest plants were the ones that would get harvested more, and it's not a very efficient process. There's a lot of seeds that bounce off the basket and get scattered. So as you're harvesting, you're actually sowing more seeds. So the chia that was the tallest will get their seeds spread out the most.
Yeah.
And so over time, the chia gets taller and taller, which helps people, but it also helps the chia because it's getting this partnership. Through this partnership, it's getting spread out more. So when people were taken out of the equation, the chia starts getting shrubbier and shrubbier and smaller lower to the ground. So there's just a lot of examples like that. Different plants like willows and cottonwoods that were used in construction. And how the pruning that was occurring within the riparian areas for those plants, how it made the plants healthier, stronger, better able to resist different types of pests that now we see in a lot of our riparian areas. They're being decimated by some of the different beetles that are getting in. Oaks are also being hit with the gold-spotted oak borer. Oaks were considered a trash tree for a long time. There used to be an oak forest all on Point Loma, and it was completely cut down mainly to be used as firewood for the rendering vats for the whale blubber that was from the whaling industry. So, bringing back the oaks, I think, is something that's really important, and it was a food source for us, but we could only harvest a little bit of it. A full-grown oak tree is 60 feet tall, so there's a lot of those acorns that go to a host of other animals that also enjoyed the acorns. And so it was not only was it a staple, but by harvesting and also by planting, and we intentionally went and planted acorns in areas that we felt were suitable, and you might not even live to see them eventually produce acorns, because it takes so long. But people
worth the wait.
People do that, and you get a large crop. But there are also so many other resources that people utilized, and it was in this kind of a relationship setting rather than that more of the kind of the European ownership domination type of relationship with the world around them. So I think there's growing recognition of that, and it's not just Native Americans, but Indigenous people all over the world have different variations of these kinds of relationships that they establish with their particular ecosystems, and in order to have that long-term sustainability with the world around them. And that doesn't mean that they had any inherent mystical knowledge or anything that helped them to do it. It might have been just plain old trial and error, that they did the wrong thing and they paid a price for it, and over time it got incorporated into their culture how to be sustainable because of that price that they paid in the past. So we have gone through a lot of transitions over time. At the last ice age, it was much wetter in San Diego, and there were forests all throughout San Diego, and shellfish were a huge part of the diet. And about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, as the climate got drier and drier, the forest started giving way to chaparral, and it opened up the canopy, and erosion started. And so erosion created the beaches in San Diego. So the beaches ended up covering a lot of the rocky coast and covering a lot of the shellfish resources. And that's when you see a transition to more of the inland resources and the harvesting of the acorns and that kind of thing. So
that's really interesting.
So it's really it was an environmental shift that we had to adapt to in our diet.
Culturally as well. Yeah, that's very interesting. I think a lot of what is termed tribal ecological knowledge is the same thing as agroecology, which is kind of a principle that we hear in schools today. So it's interesting that it's been reflected for centuries in Indigenous knowledge, and they don't seem to mention that very often in modern ecological discourse. So I'm really glad that you were able to share so much about that. We only have about 10 minutes left, so if people would like to send in questions now, we have a group chat, so I'll be willing to read off a few of those. I'm curious as well, in what ways do you see traditional relationships with nature intersecting with like sustainability, and where is there a clash in this like modern view of sustainability?
Well, it's the idea of recreating the fire mosaic is pretty much a non-starter. There are homes that are worth too much that no one's going to take the chance that you're going to burn it down and have a fire get out of hand. We have been able to do little mini burn areas and try to introduce it by cutting the plants and then burning them as we cut. And we've been able to do that on a limited scale, and there has been up in some of the forest areas some controlled burns, and I think there's an effort underway to incorporate that. We had a traditional structure that we put in the creeks as a rock drop structure that would trap sediment and enhance wetland areas, and the idea of weirs to trap water flow is nothing new. It's beaver's been doing it for thousands of years.
Learning from the locals.
And it's something that you see the Forest Service has done with wooden weirs or wire wrapped rock called gabions, and so we had rocks, and we've reintroduced that in some areas, and we've actually been able to restore many acres of wetland areas on both sides of the border.
Wow.
In Baja, we did it in one village where the riparian area was completely denuded, and we restored the riparian area, which brought back the plants that they used in basket making.
Wow.
And now they have a huge cottage industry that has developed, and they're bringing a lot of their baskets into the U.S. to sell because the resources there, the materials there now that they can utilize that had disappeared for a long time.
Yeah, and as an economist, I'm sure you're particularly focused on people being able to use their culture to obtain economic independence, essentially, or security.
Yeah, and the two go together, and I think that's all across the board. Whether you're looking at the foods that people are eating, and the traditional diet is so much more healthy than the modern diet, and to be able to have traditional crafts that can be brought back and also give people a way to make a living it's really important.
Great. So I'm also curious if you're familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which we have behind us.
In general, yeah.
Yeah. So just as a quick synopsis, if any of the listeners aren't familiar, it's basically 17 goals meant to establish a global partnership to end poverty and promote education, reduce inequalities, and all while tackling climate change. And there's a lot of overlaps between all of those goals and promoting Indigenous folks and learning from them in order to protect the environment. So I'm seeing a lot of connections with what you're saying, and I'm curious if you think the Kumeyaay people are represented in the Sustainable Development Goals, or...
Well, the goals are general, and because they're general, it goes back to that old saying, the devil's in the details. And,
yes.
And how do you implement them? And if you want to conserve water, if you're grandfathering in wasteful agricultural practices or different types of water rights that exist that promote waste, there are people who do flood irrigation because because they don't want to lose their water rights. So rather than doing drip irrigation and having a surplus of water that they could lose, they're going to flood irrigate. We have up even in the mountain areas, because people have unlimited use of their groundwater. There are people who are spray irrigating alfalfa fields, which wastes 3/4 of the water, just vanishes, it evaporates, but they don't have any restrictions on it. The only cost to them is the cost of pumping the water. So it's
so there's no ecological consequences. It's basically
there's no financial consequences.
No financial consequences. Good distinction. Yeah.
And for tribes, even as we build our economies, we're separate political jurisdictions within the state, but we're under the federal government, and federal programs like the Central California project that brought water from Northern California to Southern California was paid for with federal funds. And one of the provisions in the grant to create that project was that the water would be used for the cities, towns, in businesses, farms, and the Indian tribes. And that was actually in the provision, and yet there's never been a single water contract out of the Central California project to any Indian tribe. So we got cut out of it, and we're, these conveyance systems then, we don't have the access to it. So if we do want to get access, we have to end up paying huge amounts of money in order to try to get access. And for some of us, it's not feasible, like for Campo Reservation, because we're too far out in the rural area.
Interesting. So basically, the fact that the goals are general means that there's not enough legally binding provisions to promote Indigenous peoples?
Well, people want to grant, they want to do it painlessly. So they don't want anybody to lose anything that has something right now unless they do it voluntarily. So things like market trading programs, they really reward the people who are doing the most pollution to start with, and it hurts people who want to develop their economy, where they have to then buy into something that, through these artificial restrictions that were put in place because somebody else overdid it, or they get impacted, like endangered species. All of the development in San Diego, all of the urban sprawl, and all of this destruction of the environment that has caused more listed species to be in San Diego County than any other county in the country.
More endangered species?
More endangered species. And so where do these species live? Well, they have a tendency to clump around the people who have taken the best care of their land, which is the reservations. So then when the tribe wants to develop something, they say, oh, wait a minute, you're going to impact this endangered species. And so we end up having to go and buy land to offset or mitigate our actions, when it should be the people in the urban area who created the conditions. They should be the ones having to pay for it.
That's a really good point, actually.
And so we're the ones that have to pay the price for their activity. And it goes over and over. When you go in and you analyze this, who pays the price for and who's the one which populations created this and which ones are paying the price for it?
Yeah.
You can see this disparity.